We now come to part 3 of Human Virtues, Unit on Human Virtues, part 3, Ethics of Care. Ethics of Care as part of Virtue Ethics. Ethics of Care is a very powerful and influential version of virtue ethics, though some might consider it to be an independent theory in its own right. Ethics of Care has in fact been recently developed by feminist thinkers like Carol Gilligan, among others. According to Gilligan, men make moral decisions on the basis of rights and justice, while women make moral decisions on the basis of caring for others. So we are seeing that in this unit, we have gone on to talk about Aristotle's virtue ethics. We looked at Alasdair MacIntyre's presentation of virtue ethics and how he revived it. And he thought that there is no fixed definition of virtue, and virtue differs according to the context and the circumstance. And now we are examining another aspect of virtue ethics called as ethics of care, which has been developed by feminist thinker Carol Gilligan, who has actually gone on to provide a feminist viewpoint of virtue ethics or ethics of care, and how women make moral decisions on the basis of caring for others. According to this approach of ethics of care, men's perspective towards moral issues can be termed as ethics of justice, and that of women as ethics of care. Thus, ethics of care emphasizes close personal relationship and moral virtues such as compassion and sympathy. What does it call for? Well, ethics of care calls for a change in our perception of morality and of virtues, where it lays a great emphasis on virtues that are exemplified by women, such as taking care of others. We find that the two perspectives, the male perspective and the female perspective towards moral issues, have been termed as ethics of justice, and that of women as ethics of care. So the same moral issue is going to be examined and evaluated differently from the perspective of a man or a male, and obviously differently from the perspective of a woman or a female. Now we look at ethics of care as it has been developed by Carol Gilligan. Carol Gilligan, in fact, is the originator of ethics of care. She went on to develop this theory in direct opposition to her mentor, Lawrence Kohlberg, under whom she actually did her PhD. Now, Kohlberg presented the theory of moral development, which emphasized ethics of justice. And Gilligan found that the model that he had used to present ethics of justice had actually been based on boys, the study of boys, and he thereby went on to conclude that boys are more morally developed compared to girls. Now, this was one reasoning or conclusion that Kohlberg had presented or developed after studying, or a study that involved boys up to a certain age group. And Gilligan inherently disagreed with such a presentation wherein you are saying that moral issues or moral development of boys or men is far superior or better as compared to that of girls or women. So what did she do? Well, Kohlberg's model, according to her, was not an objective representation. Why? Because he had presented a masculine perspective of morality, which had been founded on abstract concept of duties and obligations. So Gilligan thought that Kohlberg's model was not something which could be applied, or what the study had revealed could be accepted as being the case, because according to her, it was not an objective representation at all. Rather, he had gone on to present a perspective of morality which was biased or tipped the scale towards the male or the masculine perspective. And it had been founded on abstract concept of duties and obligations. So Gilligan argued that as humans, we are inherently relational. We are responsive human beings, and human condition for each one of us, male or female, is one of connectedness. So we cannot adopt such a viewpoint that the masculine perspective of morality is more superior to that of the female. Gilligan went on to write a seminal book in a different voice in 1982, published by Harvard University Press, where she did her PhD. And it's a book on gender studies and different perspectives that men and women have on morality. She criticized in the book the position of Kohlberg, who had actually argued that there are 6 stages of development. And at the highest, or the 6th stage of development, according to Kohlberg, an individual goes on to develop a deeply held, self-defined set of principles, which he thought that that individual would like to wish to apply to all people. But Kohlberg had cautioned that not everybody can reach the 6th stage or the highest stage of development, and according to him, women tended to score at lower stages of morality. Gilligan, who had actually studied under Kohlberg, went on to challenge this idea in her seminal work in a different voice. She argued that Kohlberg's sample had included only white young males, and his work had in fact discounted the voices of women and girls. So for Gilligan, the entire study had been based on a biased viewpoint, a prejudiced viewpoint. So Gilligan went on to study and argue that women were not inferior to men when it came to moral standards. In fact, she found in her study that women thought differently from men about morality. Men, as Kohlberg had stated, looked at morality as what? As a set of rules, principles, and laws that are universally applicable. They looked at morals through the lens of ethics of justice. Ethics of justice has been viewed as the ideal because the Western culture had been patriarchal in their approach. Why? Because it had been championed by men. Women, according to her, tend to look at morality differently. Why so? Because they look at it through the lens of ethics of care. In other words, women tend to look at moral relationships, moral principles through the lens of relationships, compassion, care, caregivers, and it is this aspect of ethics of care from the perspective from which women operate that has been completely overlooked in the Western cultures. And why has it been overlooked in the Western cultures? Well, according to Gilligan, because they have a patriarchal setup. The reason ethics of care has been overlooked is because the limited power that women have typically exercised or held in the West. According to Gilligan, women's morality arises from real-life dilemmas and they do not operate from hypothetical situations. In fact, she stated that there are 3 stages that are required or that are present in the development of morality in a woman's life. These 3 stages are as follows. The first stage is the pre-conventional stage. These 3 stages talk about how ethics of care or morality or principles of morality develop in a woman. The first stage is pre-conventional, where the woman is basically focusing on her own self. Conventional stage, where the woman tends to focus on her responsibility to others. The post-conventional, where women see themselves as interdependent with others. In the first or the pre-conventional stage, the woman is focused on herself and her interests. But slowly, in the second stage or the conventional one, woman goes on to focus her attention on others and being selfless in taking care of others. Oftentimes, this conventional stage and what she needs to do in order to focus her attention on others is often defined by the society or the people in her circle. In the third stage or the post-conventional stage, the woman focuses on herself and her choices. Here, she is in control of her life. While ethics of care developed out of a study of women, yet according to Gilligan, ethics of care and ethics of justice are not mutually exclusive. It's important to understand this viewpoint or the standpoint of Gilligan. What she's saying here is that ethics of care and ethics of justice, no doubt, are two different perspectives that have been put forward by Kohlberg, one representative of the woman's perspective and the other of the man. But according to her, they are not mutually exclusive. Gilligan has in fact not focused on gender while highlighting this aspect of her study, but on these two aspects of morality. Gilligan is not stating that men cannot develop ethics of care, but women tend to have it to a greater degree. Virtues in Asian religions. After having examined ethics of care as it had been presented by Carol Gilligan, we will now study or look at virtues, how they have been presented in Asian religions. As the unit is dealing with virtue ethics, we will now look at some Asian religions that have incorporated virtue ethics as part of their belief systems. The three religions that we are going to be looking at are Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism. Each of these religions have also emphasized how one needs to, or an individual or man needs to develop virtue in order to become a better human being. We will now look at Confucianism, which originated from the works of Chinese philosopher Confucius, who lived from 551 to 479 BCE. Confucianism, in fact, has been one of the most influential religious philosophies in the history of China. It is concerned with inner virtue, morality, and respect for the community and its values. Confucius held that humaneness, or Ren as he termed the principle, which can also be translated as kind-heartedness, is derived from the web of social relationship. Hence, leading a virtuous life, according to Confucius, does not consist so much in living in accordance with one's nature as Aristotle had thought. Rather, for Confucius, we are to look at the relationship in which we are. Why? Because man is not an isolated creature. Rather, we are a part of a social network. Therefore, the most basic of all virtues is humaneness. All other virtues, be it righteousness, faithfulness, they all flow, according to Confucius, naturally from humaneness. For example, in the relationship between citizen and ruler, the right relation is righteousness, and in friendship, it is faithfulness, be it righteousness or faithfulness. All virtues are associated with the greatest virtue of humanity. Thus, Confucius brings in the social character of human person, which allows for a harmonious society. The next religion that we are going to look at is Buddhism. Buddhism is in fact one of the oldest religions in the world that originated around 2500 years back in India. The founder of Buddhism is Gautam Buddha, known as Siddhartha, a prince who gave up his privileged life to search for truth. As is well known, when he went for his usual ride on the chariot, he came across a child, a young man, an old man, and finally a dead man. All of these made him think, what exactly is the meaning of life? And what is the purpose of life? Because he did come across an ailing man, a child, a young man, old man, and finally a dead man. And his charioteer told him that all these are stages of one's life, and each and every individual would be going through these stages of one's life. So when Siddhartha, or Gautam Buddha as he was later on known, when he attained enlightenment, questioned the charioteer that would he be also going through all these? Well, the charioteer replied, yes. And that's what made him think that what was the purpose of life, or what is the meaning of life. After having thought about it, he got up in the middle of the night and left and abandoned his role as a prince and went in search and meaning, or seeking the meaning to the question of what is life. He went in search of that meaning and adopted severe measures, be it of penance or seeking alms as a beggar. But he realized over a period of time that none of them were helping him in discovering that answer to the question, what is the meaning of life, or what is life? He then realized, as he continued on with his penance, that there is a middle way between the two extremes, and it was under a Bodhi tree that Siddhartha became Buddha, the enlightened one, and that's how he was named as Gautam Buddha. He put forward the four noble truths, which are: there is suffering, there is a reason for suffering, there is cessation of suffering, or the suffering can be stopped, and finally, there is a path that will lead one to stopping the suffering. And it is these four noble truths which are crucial or form the crux of the Buddhist religion or philosophy. Buddhism has in fact adopted a very different approach from both Aristotle and Confucius. Buddhism does not accept the concept of self as a substance and holds that the human being is in fact made up of 5 skandhas which are constantly changing. As there is no permanent self, the imagined entity called self that only leads to desire and attachment, which in further lead to suffering. So as mentioned earlier, they deny the concept of a permanent self, Nairatmyavad as it is termed, and believe that there is only Kshanikvad or impermanence. There is no such thing as a permanent entity called self. Thus, for Buddhism, what are virtues? Well, virtues are neither self-actualizing, as in the case of Aristotle, not society-centered, as in the case of Confucius. Instead, it consists in freeing oneself and others from suffering. If desire is the cause of suffering, then the virtues that would free us from suffering would be tranquility and non-attachment. And in order to arrive at these virtues, one will have to be truthful, both in thought and speech, and one would have to follow what they told as, or what they defined as, the eightfold path. Next, we look at Taoism, which takes its inspiration from Buddhism with regard to the idea of flux and non-permanence. Taoism is a Chinese philosophy and religion which originated in China in 500 BCE. The founder is known as Lao Tzu, who talked about a cosmic force, Tao, which flows and binds all things together. To be virtuous in Taoism would mean going with the flow just like water in a stream, an analogy given by Tao Te Ching. The flow of water is not an image of the weak, but of the strong. Why? Because its flow cannot be resisted. A true Taoist, according to him, goes with the currents, taking control of one's senses, body and mind. This is possible only through selfless, spontaneous, simple and serene life. The Tao Te Ching is not a scripture, but a book of poetry that in fact tells us how one can live in peace and harmony with oneself, the world and the other creatures or beings. A typical verse would say in the book of Tao Te Ching, yield and overcome, become empty and full again, and bend and become straight. In other words, one can learn something by discarding old ideas and adopting new ones. Now we come to summing up. Thus, in part 3 of this unit, we've touched upon virtue ethics from a contemporary perspective of ethics of care, a concept that examines whether men and women react differently to issues of morality. Next, we have looked at 3 major Asian religions, and we have focused on virtue ethics as being integral to leading a good and virtuous life. By so doing, one could be closer to attaining nirvana or enlightenment. These religions emphasize the social aspect of human lives and lay emphasis on a spirit of detachment. Along with this, they also talk about being in a harmonious relationship with nature. Why? Because we are all connected together by a cosmic force. Thus, we can easily state that virtue ethics is a very relevant and is relevant and forms part of ethical theories. Thank you. I'm Dr. Sudhnayan Kulkarni, Associate Professor, Philosophy Department, Janki Devi Memorial College, University of Delhi.